Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn. Today we're doing an update show about the newly operating federal quarantine hotels. Travelers entering Canada are now required to take a COVID test before they can board a flight, then take a second test once they land in Canada, and they then must quarantine at a government-approved hotel while they await their results, which can take up to 3 days. Travelers must pay for their tests and for their quarantine stay, which can cost up to $2,000. Now, the rollout of this policy has been rocky to say the least. Many travelers have been unable to get through the government phone lines to book their quarantine stays, some waiting on hold for 6 to 10 hours before the call drops. Travelers who aren't able to book a hotel are then assigned a hotel when they arrive, and many have complained of price gouging. For example, one family of 3 was assigned a quarantine hotel at a cost of nearly $4,000 for 3 nights, even though their test results came back negative within only a few hours. Other travelers have complained of unsafe conditions in hotels. A woman was sexually assaulted at a Montreal quarantine hotel, which had removed the deadbolts from the guest room doors. In other hotels, rooms weren't ready and incoming travelers were corralled together in large banquet halls, creating numerous COVID contact points. And then there's the food. The cost of food is supposed to be included in the hotel stay, but many travelers have complained of waiting hours for food that is cold and often inedible. All of this is designed to stop COVID variants from entering Canada. But the reality is that the variants are already here, and the policy is exposing travelers to more risk, and it's also violating their fundamental rights. I work for a legal charity called the Canadian Constitution Foundation, and we're challenging the constitutionality of these facilities. Today, we're going to be joined by lawyer Jonathan Roth, who's representing the CCF in this challenge, and by lawyer Ryan O'Connor to talk about the constitutional problems with these hotels. But first, we're going to be joined by traveler Ray Truesdale, who recently stayed at one of these hotels. Mr. Truesdale, thanks so much for joining us. Can you tell me about your experience in the quarantine hotel?
Yes. When I got there after going through the testing that was done in Terminal 1 of the airport, I got there late because it took close to 2.5 hours to check in. So at that time, you couldn't get anything to eat. So the next morning, I got up and I ordered something. And I did get some food that morning. And then I went to reorder in the afternoon. And how you did it at that time, whether it was an app you ordered it through, well, the app didn't work. And I picked up the phone trying to call room service or the front desk, and they would not answer the phone.
Wow. So
I decided to go down and go to the lobby, even though you're not really, or you should do that. But I opened the doors of the elevator and the video shows just pandemonium, mayhem going on, screaming and yelling.
Like
because
of
a lot
other
of people,
other travelers who were looking for food?
Yes. A lot of them haven't eaten in hours and they didn't have the food. A lot of them were vegetarians that I could hear, they're vegetarians. In one case, they offered them ham and cheese sandwich, but it was just, there was no answers coming back.
So how long did you go
itself.
without food when you were in the hotel?
Well, the one day, it was 23 hours by the time I got, because it was the next day. And I did get one bottle of water, and people were getting some water, but you had to go down to the lobby to get this.
So did you feel safe in this facility? I mean, people are supposed to be kept apart from each other.
No, that's one thing. But the other thing is the phone didn't work. So if you did have to call for help, you couldn't get a hold of anybody. And I know a lot of people, like when I come to Canada, I have to arrange my cell phone that it works internationally. And I know a lot of people don't do that. So they're depending on the internet or whatever to call out.
So Ray, how much did you pay for this whole experience?
I think, well, I just been going back and forth through American Express because I'm going over the charges, but I never got an itemized bill. So the total bill came to like $2,000, a little over. But But I had to stay an extra day because my test results came back damaged specimen. So I had to go back down to Terminal 1 to get another
Right.
test.
That just sounds
retest.
like an absolute mess. Welcome back to Canadian Justice. We're talking about the federal government's new policy requiring incoming travelers to quarantine in government-contracted hotels. Joined by me now are two legal experts, Jonathan Roth, who's representing my charity, the Canadian Constitution Foundation, in a legal challenge of these quarantine rules, and Mr. Ryan O'Connor, a legal expert who has challenged other COVID measures in Ontario. Welcome both of you to the show. Thanks for joining. Now, Mr. Roth, I'd like to start with you. Can you tell me about the legal challenge that the Canadian Constitution Foundation is bringing to this policy and why we're bringing it?
Absolutely. Hi, Christine. It's good to be with you. This is a constitutional challenge to the government's order requiring air travelers entering Canada to quarantine at government-approved hotels at their own expense. Like any constitutional challenge, the fundamental idea here is to protect the civil liberties of Canadians. COVID-19 has caused governments to take action on a range of fronts, but the important thing is that they're still constrained by the Constitution when they take action, even in the face of something as serious as COVID-19. And so the idea behind the challenge is to assert rights and make sure that the government is not infringing upon those in this pandemic.
Now, Mr. O'Connor, from 10,000 feet up, although I guess we shouldn't be 10,000 feet up these days, but what are your concerns with this policy?
Well, thanks for having me again, Christine. It appears that this policy is nothing more than pandemic performance art from the federal government. The federal government has had a year to secure the borders, to ensure the reduction of viral spread and to prevent the importation of COVID-19. It's done everything but that, I should say. The federal government has not stopped the importation of COVID-19. And now what it's doing to compensate for the fact that its measures may have been inadequate is it's forcing Canadians into quarantine, but only certain Canadians and only certain individuals who travel. If you cross a land border, you're not subject to a hotel quarantine requirement, but for some reason you are if you travel by air. This is really sort of, if you're vacationing Canadian or a traveler, you're coming into the country and you're going straight to Club Fed, but it's not actually an all-inclusive as you would think it would be.
Yeah, they don't seem to include a lot. I mean, I don't know if you saw Mr. Truesdale, who was just on with us, but they didn't even feed him for 23 hours. So, Mr. Roth, I want to talk about some of the specific rights that are engaged here, like Section 6 of the Charter, which is the right to enter, remain in, and leave Canada. Is this right being engaged if travelers are still able to enter Canada? It's just that they need to pay now in order to enter.
Well, we certainly think so. The idea here is that there's a non-trivial cost associated with having to quarantine in a government-approved hotel. And for at least some Canadians, and we'll talk about some specific cases shortly, but for at least some Canadians, they simply cannot afford to do that. Or they may have some other reason why they're not able to quarantine in a hotel. And so for that reason, it's effectively prohibiting or preventing those Canadian citizens from leaving Canada if they know that they can't quarantine in a hotel when they come back, or from coming back in the case where they've already left. So we certainly think that those rights are engaged.
Okay, Mr. O'Connor, I want to follow up with you on something you mentioned, the land border. So if you cross at a land border, you're not required to go into a quarantine facility, but you are if you fly in. So why is the government treating these two types of travel so differently?
I think it's to simply to discourage and punish those who might be leisure travelers from going away in the first place. If they make it completely inconvenient to travel by forcing you into a quarantine hotel to get retested after you've been required to take a COVID test prior to departure, then Canadians and other individuals might think twice about even traveling. It's punitive in nature. It's meant to discourage individuals from traveling. It's not actually addressing the mischief that it's supposed to, and that's to diminish viral spread. If you cross a land border, you're subject to a 14-day quarantine requirement, but you can do so at home. Whereas if you fly into the country for some reason, you have additional added punitive measures because you elected to fly rather than cross the land border, and you're still subject to a 14-day quarantine requirement. It's arbitrary and in my view, inappropriate.
Yeah, it certainly seems like there's a lot of unnecessary piling of these requirements on top of one another, these multiple tests, the quarantine on top of the 14-day quarantine at home on top of the hotel quarantine. We're going to talk more about some of these issues when we come back from this commercial break. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing the federal quarantine hotel policy. Now, Mr. Roth, can you tell me about some of the individuals who are bringing this claim, who you're representing related to this quarantine hotel? What are some of their stories?
Sure. So we have a number of applicants. Each of them has unique circumstances, but the common thread among them is that the travel that they want to do or intend to do is for compassionate reasons. So these are not leisure travelers, which Mr. O'Connor referred to. Not that there's anything wrong with leisure travel. I remember the days when taking a vacation was actually a good thing. But these people are people who need to travel. In some cases, they have elderly and infirm parents outside of Canada who they need to care for. In some cases, they may need to attend the funeral of a relative outside of Canada. In some cases, a spouse may have a partner outside of Canada who has surgery that they need to be cared for. And so these are people who are traveling for reasons that nobody can impugn, and yet they are being punished when they return to Canada nevertheless.
And my understanding is that there's an exemption for compassionate travel, but it's only for compassionate travel into Canada. Is that correct?
Well, it's true that there are compassionate exemptions. There are some limited exemptions in the order. The problem with the exemptions is that they appear to be limited to attending to certain compassionate needs of people residing in Canada. And the fact is that we have applicants, and there are people in Canada who may need to travel outside of the country for the same or similar reasons. And it doesn't appear to be any rationale for allowing people to do that for people residing in Canada, but not for people outside of Canada.
Yeah,
and that's one of the shortcomings of this order in our view.
It certainly is strange that they'd contemplate an exemption for one set of circumstances, but not the equally likely opposite set of circumstances. So, Mr. Connor, I have a question for you. Are travelers' rights being engaged in these hotels themselves? You know, we've heard stories about women being sexually assaulted, about people being exposed to multiple COVID touch points that they might not have if they just return to their home. And individuals like Ray, who we just spoke to, who wasn't fed. What are their rights that are being engaged with the actual practice in these facilities?
Well, there are several charter rights that are engaged when you're not being fed, you're not being given food that you can eat if you're a vegetarian, as Mr. Truesdale mentioned. You're forced to be in a federally mandated facility. On account of that, you have the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, which is guaranteed under Section 7 of the Charter. If you're not being fed, if your access to food and potentially drink and water is being deprived, then Section 7 of the Charter is engaged. And if it's done so in a way that, for example, is arbitrary or inappropriate, then it violates your charter rights. I also note the question that, again, Mr. Truesdale raised about vegetarians. Some persons are vegetarians not by choice, but because of their cultural or religious observance. If they're being forced to into a quarantine facility mandated by the government, but are not being provided culturally sensitive food, religiously sensitive food, then there are issues with respect to discrimination as well. And you're entitled to equal protection of the law under the charter. You're entitled to not be discriminated against by a government that's forced you to stay somewhere you don't want to be.
Ryan, can you comment on the liability of these hotels themselves as businesses, not just, the government's obligations, but what obligations, civilly do these facilities have to the people who are under their care?
Well, in Ontario, at least in our province here, the hotels, the businesses themselves are subject to consumer protection rules. But I think most importantly, there is the potential for civil liability, both for the government as well as the hotels, if they're providing, for example, inadequate security. And you referred to the instance of a woman who was unfortunately found to have been assaulted in one of these quarantine hotels. If you're being assaulted, if the venue isn't secure, the hotel itself is not providing you adequate food, water, and drink, and then that gives rise to civil responsibility for the hotel or the management company. And ultimately, you can pursue those rights in court in terms of compensation for your pain and suffering, or potentially breach of contract or breach of the Consumer Protection Act.
Well, it's certainly troubling, some of the stories that we've been hearing from some of these places not being fed, people being assaulted, the locks being taken off of the doors. And I think that there's some responsibility that these facilities themselves have. Thank you both. We're going to jump back into this right after the break. Welcome back. I'm Christine Van Gyn. Now let's get back into our conversation about quarantine hotels. Now, Mr. Roth, the charter allows the government to, we have rights, but the charter allows the government to limit rights in when those limits are justified. And you argue that these particular limits aren't justified. Can you explain why?
Absolutely. It's a great question because it strikes at the heart of this application. It's true that the government can limit rights, but the government has to do two things in order to do so. First, the government has to show that it's pursuing a compelling objective. And more importantly here, the government has to show that the limit on rights is proportionate to the objective that it is trying to achieve. And that's the issue that I think the government is going to have in this case, because it's possible to imagine, and you don't need much of an imagination to actually do that, but it's possible to imagine many other ways that the government can achieve its public health objective here without forcing people into government-approved accommodation at their own expense. For example, many of the people that we've spoken to, and the applicants in our case, have been able to and can in the future quarantine safely and effectively in their own home. And the government will have to show that a quarantine in a hotel approved by the government is actually safer and more effective than a quarantine at home. And it's not clear at all that that's the case. It's also not clear that this has to be imposed at the traveler's own expense. Presumably, if people are going to be forced into these facilities, that could be done at the government's expense, which would infringe upon rights in a lesser manner.
Now, Ryan, what's your take on this? Do you think these are justified limits in the name of public health?
Well, just to that point, I don't think anyone's really has issue with the policy of the 14-day quarantine. We might take issue with the number of days, and we can have a discussion about that publicly and discuss the science. But there's no reason why that has to be done in a federally mandated facility. A court is going to look at whether or not the policy is indeed arbitrary. An arbitrary policy does not survive Section 1, which is the reasonable limits section of the Charter. And it is arbitrary because it only applies to individuals who arrive in Canada by air, irrespective of why they were traveling. Someone who arrives by land does their 14-day quarantine at home. That on its face is arbitrary, and government has to, and I don't think it's going to be able to, explain to the court how persons arriving by air are more susceptible to spread COVID-19 than someone arriving by a vehicle over a land crossing. And we look at video from these facilities. Mr. Truesdale discussed and what he observed, you see individuals who are crowding at a lobby to try to get food. They're getting into a bus to go to one of these quarantine hotels. They're actually potentially causing more viral spread by the government's policy. And I can't think of a single more way that we could describe it as arbitrary than what I just have.
Now, Mr. Roth, we only have about 10 seconds. What's the timeline on this challenge that you're bringing? How quickly can it be heard?
Well, that remains to be seen. And certainly we're going to do what we can to move it forward. And we hope that the government will itself recognize that this is a very important case and that they will cooperate with us to make sure that it gets heard.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much for joining me. This has been a fascinating conversation, and good luck with the case, Mr. Roth.
Thanks, Christine.
We've heard today about the absolute chaos unfolding in Canadian airports and at the federally mandated quarantine hotels. Travelers are being mistreated, and while this policy was designed to keep Canadians safe, it appears to be exposing travelers to more unnecessary risk. Quarantine hotels are not supposed to be a punishment for travelers, but that's how they appear to be operating. Travel isn't prohibited, and many individuals have good reasons to travel. People need to travel for work, to receive medical care, to reunite with family, or to assist sick loved ones. These aren't people who should be punished, and our Constitution protects the rights of these people. Yes, even in a pandemic. The government needs to change their policy and allow for more exemptions from these quarantine hotels. They also need to ensure that the hotels carrying out a government policy are treating people humanely, and right now they aren't. But what do you think? Are these quarantine hotels an unjustified limit on our fundamental freedoms? Is the mistreatment of travelers in these facilities a violation of our Constitution? You be the judge. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.